So I've started into this topic of early trauma or developmental trauma. When I start to study something or get into something, it's more than just a mental exercise or just learning intellectually. I actually kind of try to test it on myself, checking how does that sound? Does that sound true? I kind of tracking within my system. With this topic, it goes quite deep. It goes super deep, probably to the bottom of all the human issues ever. And heard somebody refer to this you can run into some pretty dark stuff, and that kind of takes you a bit, you kind of end up lingering there just because that needs this time and space to unfold. So it took me a while to actually track this so that when I present this, actually I really get it and it sounds more true than just reading, some information that I got out there somewhere. So I am going to move on to the next piece in this series on childhood trauma. But let's do a recap. So in the previous video, I talked about the process of how and why a trauma happens to a human being since birth. And even before that, there is a cycle of responses that it's rooted in our neurobiology, especially how a living being responds to the negative impact of its environment. Consequently, now we know this really impacts the whole trajectory of life into adulthood in a way in which it moves a person into a survival mode as opposed to thriving, which in turn affects a person's development on a psychological, emotional, and physiological level. Because, now it's known how high levels of stress correlate with chronic illnesses. But what is the exact impact? And this is what I want to look at in this video. I will share the 5 survival styles that people emerge with when their natural core capacities, such as connection, attunement, trust, autonomy, and overall love, which correspond to the intimate needs I covered in a previous video, are compromised or hindered by trauma, the corresponding early stages of development. I would look at how a person's sense of identity is skewed, what are the core fears for each, what got compromised, and what is the actual reality. So let's look at this. Initially, as we learn to live within the limitations imposed by our environment, our survival strategies are life-saving responses, especially as children, and these are successful adaptations, actually, not pathology. However, the adaptations and accommodations we make, although once they were protective, limit us as adults. They become these self-imposed prisons, because living life based on adaptations learned in childhood restricts us in our capacity to respond appropriately and creatively to the many challenges of adult life. In other words, what in children was adaptive, in adults becomes maladaptive. For example, a baby in a stressful environment, crying but not getting an answer, will learn that asking for help is futile and conclude that he is not valuable enough to have their needs fulfilled. So as an adult, she will struggle to ask for things or pursue goals, relationships, defaulting to a worldview of deprivation and resignation, or never feeling satisfied, which is often accompanied also by underlying depression, grief, frustration, disappointment, and anger, which in turn alienates others, so the chances of reaching out decrease even more. Does this sound familiar at all? And this can be so subtle, it's such a transparent, kind of ingrained way of operating that it's not exactly obvious. These survival styles, after they have outlived their usefulness, function to maintain an ongoing disconnection, distorting the present experience and creating symptoms. Furthermore, they become rigid beliefs about who we are and what the world is like. our beliefs about ourselves and the world, together with the physiological patterns or bodily felt sensations that these beliefs are associated with, crystallize into a familiar sense of who we are. This is what we come to view as our identity. However, what we take to be our identity is better described as identification. And I briefly mentioned this in a video about identity that I will link in the description, as well as a link in the right hand corner. See you in the next video.